Have you ever dove deep into the wide expanse of the knowledge of the internet to try to find the perfect piece of advice to apply to the problem you're having, only to collect all these little nuggets of information, only to find out that they don't actually fit the problem you're trying to solve? Welcome to the advice problem, said the guy who's sitting on the couch giving advice nobody asked for. The advice problem is something that I think gets a lot of people hung up, including myself, which is that we tend to seek advice when we're trying to accomplish something hard that we don't know how to do, that we don't have enough knowledge or experience about. And so we seek advice from people we trust, from people who have done the thing before, from people who are farther ahead in our journey than we are. And for the most part, this is a pretty good idea. This is what you should be doing when you feel stuck. You should ask for advice. But the problem comes in when the advice starts to take away from you actually doing the work. One of the hardest parts about advice these days, especially in the online world on YouTube, is that a lot of the advice is actually pretty good. There's a lot of really good advice out there, and it's really tempting to dive in and try to take all of it. But some of the problems come in when we start to realize that just because advice is good doesn't mean that it's good for me. And there's also a second trap where we can start to hide behind advice finding, and in a similar way to where we hide behind our systems and planning our systems, seeking too much advice actually prevents us from getting the real work done and prevents us from actually integrating and using the advice that we found so helpful. It can also be really hard as someone seeking advice to tell exactly what level advice you're getting. There's a disconnect between sometimes advice being about a higher level concept and advice being for a more beginner mindset and a more beginner kind of pace of doing the work. Something that I experienced this with is operating a camera. I'm still pretty new to that whole thing, and a lot of the advice on YouTube about how to use a camera is fantastic. It's really, really good. It's really in-depth. You could spend hours and hours seeking how to use all the settings on your specific camera, or how to find the perfect lens and get the right aperture and the shutter speed and all of that. And while all of it is good, not all of it applies for someone who hasn't even started filming yet or doesn't even know how to frame yourself in a shot, which I'm obviously still learning. And so spending too much time on the advice about what the perfect ISO setting is, or what the perfect shutter speed is, or 24 versus 30 frames per second, a lot of that is more advanced. And just simply starting to do the work, you will start to figure out what advice you need to seek. So once I actually started filming stuff and just kind of ignored all the settings, I could look back at what it was I had created and been like, the colors are a little blown out here, the light is oversaturated over here. Like, I wonder how I can start to fix that. And then you start your journey of advice seeking, as opposed to knowing that you have a long journey ahead of you and trying to figure out what advice people at the end would give you for the last mile. It's like trying to ask a marathon runner how to get through the last 5 miles when you haven't even figured out how to get through the first 5 miles. The advice that you get about the race as a whole is really good, but if you're still struggling with getting through the first 5 miles, then the advice for the last 5 just isn't going to apply. It's going to sound really good. It's going to be inspiring and make you feel prepared to get to those final 5 miles. But if you're still working on the skills to be able to make it through the first 5, then you have an advice problem. You need to start to filter out what advice you're taking and what advice you're seeking out so that you can really focus on just doing the work and getting the reps in, so that when the advice is presented for a larger problem, you actually are at that larger problem. And sometimes because advice sounds really good, and some people are really good at explaining and packaging really complex advice in a beginner-friendly way, you can start to collect a series of pieces of advice that don't actually add up to the thing that you're trying to create or the thing you're trying to accomplish, but it still feels good advice. And then you might be tempted to start to follow those pieces of advice instead of the thing which you actually wanted to do in the first place. And it's a weird space to get into because it can be really addicting to hear good advice and to hear people who have gotten to where you want to be talk about the last couple of steps of their journey and what it looked like and the things they've learned along the way and how you can apply it to your journey, but you haven't even set foot out of the house yet. And so making sure you're primed for the kind of knowledge that you're seeking out, and especially if you're trying to seek out advanced knowledge or trying to do something complex, really starting with the baseline of just doing the basic work and fumbling through it and being totally bad at it, and learning to build those baseline skills that are going to allow you to actually integrate the higher level, more complex advice and knowledge. And another place where advice can start to become a trap, even if you are at the advanced stages of whatever it is you're working on, we can get caught in thinking we need advice when really we just need to go headfirst into the problem. This comes in the form of people just wanting to pick your brain, or they want to call a meeting and they don't really have an agenda, or they want to ask you a few questions, but those questions are so broad you have a hard time answering what that might be. And I know that I've done this, and really what it is, it's just another way to avoid actually doing the work that's right in front of you. And it's a way to kind of help yourself feel better about the fact that you're going to have a hard time with this. And sometimes people will respond in ways that get you really jazzed and excited, and then you can go take that work. But more often than not, you just end up in a place where you're just constantly consuming the advice instead of actually putting it into practice or figuring out whether or not you needed the advice in the first place. Because there's plenty of times when I've thought about that I should call a mentor or I should call somebody who I know who's gone through the same problem. But most of the time, the reality is that once I start working without calling them and without seeking more advice, some of the answers I'm seeking actually start to become more clear than if I had called them and just wasted time, both mine and theirs, on asking them questions that I would have answered myself anyways. So give yourself permission to stop seeking advice and just get started. I believe in you. You don't need my advice.